I'm Anton, and I'm a climatalist. And chances are, you might be too. Climatalists sit at the intersection of business and nature. They want to play a key role in minimising the human-led impact on the environment, but they also understand the realities of living and working in a modern, capitalist world. In this series, I'll be proving that climatalists are already out there leading the charge to marry their own good businesses with sustainable climate principles. This week, my guest is Johnny Kahlbetzer. He's CEO of Twynam Group, an investment group specialising in the environmental and agricultural sectors. Now, Johnny and I got into a little disagreement this episode around the concept of the green premium. He staunchly believes people simply won't pay extra for sustainable solutions, whereas I'm a little more hopeful. Now, the data can look sobering because less than 7% of consumers today consistently choose eco-friendly options when they come with a higher price tag. However, 40% of people could be convinced to make the switch in the long term, so the debate is still open. It's not all disagreements though. We also chat about the world of investing in climate tech. Johnny has both pitched and been pitched to with solutions, so some interesting insights here. And he also gives some solid advice to the budding climate tech entrepreneurs out there as to what investors are actually looking for. So if you're interested in getting inside the mind of one of Australia's most prominent climate tech investors, stay tuned. Johnny, welcome to Climatalist.
Thank you, Anton.
So, Johnny, we'll kick off with a bit of history. A big part of your dad's legacy was his attitude towards protecting our natural environment. And when we spoke yesterday, you mentioned that he'd never cut down a tree.
Well, yeah, we certainly have cut down trees, and part of agricultural development is that. But it was only if it had to be. If someone spray plane went over somewhere and killed some trees, it'd be not very impressed and things like that. So we always had a view on environment, and we always, in the agricultural production methodologies, always sort of thought of how can we do things better, less impactful in a negative way on the natural environment, etc. So that's always been sort of a little bit of a core feeling to the family.
If you take us back a little bit further, so your dad was an immigrant, came to Australia, your family came to Australia, started at zero, basically.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through that story and how you kind of got to the position that you folks are now?
Well, Dad came in with zero, although his father was, call it wealthy, but post-World War II in Germany, no one's particularly wealthy. So he came from a family which had some assets, but he didn't talk to his dad back then, so he came basically on his own. End up in Perth, end up in Adelaide, and then Melbourne, trading company. Over time, you end up with them in China and in Germany, working for them, and then set up his own business with a colleague from that company. So he handled most of Australia's steel exports and specialty steel imports for quite a while until BHP, which was back then, decided to cancel or stop selling steel and only acting on an agency basis. And then he did a lot of just investing, and agriculture sort of started off as one hobby farm, led to two, and we ended up being the largest agricultural producers in Australia sort of in the 2000s and early 2010s, and also had large agricultural investments in Argentina. And then sort of through the teens into the early 20s, the family has exited all of that. And today we have a number of different asset classes within the family, but our main, or on my side of the family, main interest is in the early stage investment in sort of decarbonisation technologies, and been doing that we made our first investment back in 1999, funding a CSIRO project looking for a vaccine against enteric methane, and we've followed that space and done other investments in environment and climate sort of through to today. And 18 months ago, we launched a fund to manage outside capital in the space, and here we are today.
Amazing. Well, look, I'm super keen to. There's so many things to double click on in there. But before we go into the investment side of things, your personal experience around nature, how is that, or has that informed any of the things that you've been doing in this space?
Yeah, look, always like the outdoors, whether that's been skiing, rafting, whatever, being in the bush, horse riding. So have an affinity with that. Like, I'm not someone who likes to be sitting in an apartment all the time. I'd rather be outside. So that part of my core. I guess when you look at climate change, one of the things which sort of always triggers me, or in my mind, is like having seen glaciers, etc., and thinking, well, are my grandkids ever going to see that, or are they going to disappear? I guess that's sort of the one trigger point which I always think about when we talk about climate change.
What will the experience for your kids look like?
Well, it's probably just going to be rock rather than ice and rock. Well, not for my kids. My kids are like 20. So, yeah, they've seen it all, but whether their kids actually get to see that or something different.
Different question. So, on the topic of the family farm, or the family farm business, why did Twynam divest?
Well, we just had enough of being in agriculture. Like, it's asset rich, cash poor. At the scale we were at, you always got a drought somewhere or a flood somewhere. Certain members of the family weren't so keen on agriculture versus others, and we just thought, we decided to sell the water, and we always knew at that point that it would sort of mean that a number of the farms would move out because we didn't want to operate them as dry land farms. We had a bunch of irrigation farms and a couple of others which we kept, and over time, we just sold them for various reasons. Yeah. And then Argentina brother sold a couple of years ago for very different reasons. Like, farming in Argentina is a very different gig to Australia. It's much easier agronomically, but substantially more complicated politically and economically, tax-wise, etc. So, like, when you hear people in government and unions, etc., and social groups saying, oh, don't worry about inflation, worry more about economic growth and employment, I very quickly say everyone should go and visit Argentina, Venezuela and Zimbabwe, because endemic inflation is a core evil of society. Like, you don't break it, and the people who get hurt by it are the poor. Like, it destroys society fabric totally. So managing a business in that environment, having exchange rate controls, cash movement controls, etc., it's a total different situation. Like, the average, 99.9% of Australians would just die in that situation if you just put them there, because it's just so foreign to the way we are.
So on that point, like, it sounds like you had a monkey come off your back, and it's been a pretty sounds like a fairly intensive, hard period of work with the agricultural properties.
Oh, well, I don't think it's particularly hard. Just is what it was, or is what it is. And we just, like, between the members of the family, decided, well, we're going to change, and that's what we did. The work we do today is equally hard. It's just different. Interesting.
Has it given you a different perspective? So I guess, from going from being an operator to being an investor primarily, has that shifted your perspective in any way?
Well, not really. Like, we were investors. Like, we bought and sold lots of assets over the years in agriculture. Like, at the end, we had sort of 24 farms, 22 different locations. But over the 20, 30 years, we sort of bought, and we had sort of 50 properties come through our book. So
you were a trader with an agricultural focus, and you've shifted, you've diversified.
Well, we were an investor, and sort of we bought and sold properties depending on where we thought we wanted to be, and as we grew, sort of certain properties fitted, others didn't, and I don't think there's anyone in the country who's owned as many different properties as we have over that business's lifetime. Yeah.
Amazing. So given that experience, how optimistic are you that we can actually decouple economic growth from environmental impact at a global scale?
I'm not confident at all, because I don't think human nature can change. but I'm not a believer that economic growth is a benefit to anyone. It's just the way the current economy model is set up, and everyone thinks that economic growth is the best thing because everyone thinks having 4 TVs in the house is better than having 3 and better than having 2. When I was born, there was no TV, and then there was one TV, and it was black and white and barely showed a picture, and now then it was a colour and better picture, etc., etc. So human nature is to have more and more, and we see that. Like, we've got Black Friday where people are going to buy a whole lot of crap which they're probably never going to use or use once. So yeah, it's human nature which is the problem in regards to the economic growth and the sustainability of the environment. And that's why we do what we do with our venture business. Given that we don't think human nature will change, and certainly not quickly enough to help stop the trajectory that carbon emissions are on, our view is that the only way it can change that is through the hip pocket by making what people buy less carbon intensive, and the only way you get them to buy that less carbon intensive item is by being cheaper than the incumbent. So we're actually in some ways counteracting ourselves because we're after a cheaper product which potentially will increase more consumption, but hopefully at a much lower carbon intensity.
And in that, so is it circularity that you're focused on? Is it carbon intensity? I mean, you mentioned carbon intensity. What does that look like?
For us, it's carbon intensity. That's what we focus on. Like, we have invested in stuff in circularity, etc. And we fully support circularity, recycling, all those sorts of things. Our problem with it is how to get it to scale quickly without government pushing it. Like, I think it's really hard to change that the habits of society unless it's regulated. And obviously, governments. Most people say government does too many things, and I tend to agree with that. But how far down that chain of waste management and designs criteria, rules, they want to get involved in is a question.
Interesting. So specifically focused on carbon intensity, can you give us an example of a couple of...
Like air conditioning system, if you can get same output for 60% less power consumption, similar capex, you're ahead of the game. So that's a classic example.
So we talked about capex and opex in our conversation. Actually, let's turn to that in a moment. But any specific sectors that you're seeing where these interesting, these sorts of opportunities are arriving?
The ecosystem's growing dramatically. There's no question that, like 6 years ago to today, there are a lot more entrepreneurs, scientists, etc., working in the space and trying to do things like better, less with a decarbonisation focus. So I think it's happening everywhere. You sort of see in waves, and maybe it's just because you sort of constantly, like something comes you really like, and then you look more deeply and you find, oh yeah, there are actually quite a number of people looking at the same thing. I guess more recently we've seen more things happening in the HVAC space. Battery management, like the stationary battery management seems to be an area which there's a bit more interest in at the moment. The ag space, there's always things ticking over there. We struggle with most ag tech in how to actually scale it. Most people say, oh, you're going to get this many customers, and with our history of ag, I just think most of that's sort of over-expectation because farmers move slowly, partly because they're most are cash poor. There are a couple of segments in the agricultural industry which are very profitable. And those industries you can sort of make headway pretty quickly, but the majority are tough. But we're invested in a couple of those ag spaces, and what I like about those is like if you talk about enteric methane, if you get a product which can sort of get a 50% reduction in methane emissions.
Enteric methane, just for the...
Enteric methane, it means methane emissions from ruminants, so predominantly cattle and sheep worldwide. So it's, call it 10% of the world's emissions in a CO2 basis. So if you could come up with a cheap methodology which, say, cut 50%, obviously 80% would be better, you're chopping 5% of the world's emissions out overnight. So that's sort of, and I said we invested in one of those technologies 25 years ago. Didn't quite work well enough.
I guess the other interesting thing about methane is it's not just about slowing the emissions rate, because once you slow the emissions rate, because the methane lasts less time in the atmosphere, there's a much bigger net impact.
Yeah. So if you could knock all the methane out tomorrow, methane comes from a couple of main sources, livestock, as I mentioned, rice production, and then comes out, well, coal and gas mine leakages. When you say gas, like gas infrastructure, so pipelines, wellheads, etc. So they're the main, and can also come from landfill as well. So, but if you could get rid of all of that overnight, you'd have a significant impact in like the CO2 equivalent emissions over the next 30 years.
To sort of buy us some time to sort our stuff out on the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I mentioned to you when we spoke yesterday, Windfall Bio, one of the previous guests is hardcore focused in on this problem. So it'll be interesting to see how that business scales. So let's talk about this piece around CapEx and OpEx. Why is that important, and how might it relate to the financing of green tech?
So as said, our view is the only way you get products which are less carbon intensive into being used. And I say that because human nature, like we know people aren't going to pay a green premium. You look at organic vegetables, everyone knows they're better for you and we should eat them. Well, they cost whatever percentage more than the other carrot, lettuce in the supermarket shelf, but I don't know what the actual stat is, but it's 0.001%.
It's a low percentage.
Population. So people won't pay a green premium if they think it's going to keep them alive longer. So for
maybe most people won't pay a green premium. Let's take
that is true. Most, by far the largest majority, won't pay a green premium.
I'll concede that.
So the only way to change the impact of our consumption trends is to make it less carbon intensive. The only way you're going to cause that is through the hip pocket. So
it's got to be cheaper.
So if you go to a building, like let's just say you build your house, like everyone, like cost of building a house today is eye-watering. So one of the last things to go into the house is the actual air conditioning system. So someone's got an option between 10,000 and 8,000. They've bloody blown their budget. They go 8,000, even though the OpEx and whatever might be.
The cost of running it, the running costs. Yeah.
So they pick the cheaper capital cost up front. The same happens with office buildings, all that sort of thing. So we're very much of the view that CapEx has to be at least equal, if not better, and then the OpEx sells it as well. And obviously in some industry, like if you get to industrial scale stuff, then there's more logical business discussion. So your CapEx can potentially be a little bit higher, can be higher if your OpEx is much higher, because everyone looks at an IRR or cash flow model. So in a household, that's gone.
If we break that down, so let's say there's a household listening and they're thinking about, I think that air conditioner example is really useful. Can you break that down, those concepts? So CapEx, OpEx, in the context of a house, in terms that someone like a regular household.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's just use that example: 10 grand, 8 grand, but that'd be like quite big. It's not just a single split air conditioning unit, but let's just say you've got four rooms, and like in one scenario, it's $2,500 a room versus $2,000 for each split air conditioner. So I was talking to somebody who's in that space, and they said, like, there's a US example, but same here. Our air conditioning system will cost you $200 a year to run, and this other system will cost you $600 to run. So there's a $400 saving. So $400 over 5 years is $2,000. Like, you paid for your air conditioner in the saving by going for the better air conditioner than the $500 cheaper. You'd actually pay that difference in 1.25 years. So that's the OPEX saving, which households don't necessarily contemplate and understand, and it's not really shown in marketing materials. And that's where sort of that sticker shock or sticker value is relevant for the average purchaser and in society consumer, when businesses would look at that cost of operation for like a 10-year period and go, that makes, I'm going to be thousands of dollars ahead of using that system.
So business will think longer term, whereas households will think shorter term, perhaps.
Generally.
Yeah. It is interesting.
So it depends on what that CapEx difference is for businesses too. Like if it's in 10%, yeah, that's easily argued. If you double, then you've got to really have an OPEX.
Couple of ideas for you. So I mentioned to you when we spoke last that my background is in prop tech. One of the interesting things that's happening in the prop tech space is in the sustainability context is that there's an emerging set of standards that describe not only the features that exist in a property, but also the running costs of the property on a go-forward basis. So when a tenant or a purchaser is evaluating a home, they don't just look at, hey, this is the cost of the home. Yep. This is what it's going to cost me to run.
4-star or 5-star, 6-star.
All that stuff. But actually, putting it in a measurable term and kind of, I guess, forecasting out what your power is going to cost you over time. So if we can simplify that for the consumer, I wonder if there's an interesting opportunity there.
I totally think there is. But who's gathering the data? Who's verifying the data? Of course, plenty of people bullshit in advertising.
Real estate agents. I mean, I love real estate agents. They're my favourite people, but also, yeah.
Jesus, you like lawyers as well.
Wow, I'm retired. Yeah.
And then you got to educate people on potentially what the life of ownership means. But really, most people are smarter than what you think. In that regard, if you can give them,
the right
information which they believe is valid. Like, problem is, like most people, or a lot of people, invalidly think that what they're told by a manufacturer can be like
misleading.
You look at cars and they say, okay, there's 15 k's to the litre or whatever, and you actually drive and you get 12 k's to the litre.
And the same thing in the battery context,
testing
right?
systems. Yep, the batteries are the same. Yep.
So people are constantly saying, they say 450 kilometre range, I've driven 300 k's and it's gone.
Yep. Hopefully it's not that bad, but
yeah, that's
the example.
Some of that is confirmation bias. So the other example, the other idea I have for you. So there's a company here in Greenhouse called National Renewable Networks, another former podcast guest. They are growing at an incredibly aggressive rate, but they're sort of taking advantage of some of the arbitrage around, they can see the returns on battery and solar technology in a residential context, and they're sort of rolling that up into a financing scheme. So they're kind of capitalizing the future, the future value of the discount, and they're creating a new asset class around that. So that's a really interesting emerging model that we're seeing.
So I think that's got validity, and you can extend that into other. But you're also seeing some power companies starting to contemplate, e.g. providing HVAC as a service.
Interesting.
I haven't seen it in Australia yet. I'm aware of one power company talking to, like, having a chat about it. In the US, I know of a couple where they're doing it. Not implementing yet because the HVAC systems are sort of still being commercialised in that early stage, but I think that's an area where it can happen, especially if the systems have got some ability to be charged off-peak.
It's interesting in that context as well. I guess if you're thinking about, and as a service offering, you're constantly optimizing the efficiency of the operation of whatever asset it is that you have out in the marketplace, and that might be from a carbon standpoint or otherwise. So stuff doesn't decay. It doesn't sit in a building for 2 decades and be constantly maintained and pollute. Sort of shifts the landscape. Yeah, as a service, I mean, I can think of industrial heat as a service. That seems to be an emerging opportunity. There's battery recycling as a service. That there's an interesting startup that I've come across as well in my travel. So this as a service model, it seems to be an interesting vector.
And it tends to be where you're trying to avoid that CapEx decision. So you're giving people a purely an OpEx cost of operating during a year benefit, or capping what their cost is going to be.
Fascinating. All right, so let's talk about some outcomes. So when you think about success in investing climate solutions, there's obviously the return profile, but you're thinking about the carbon impact. How do you think about success, and how do you pitch that to investors when you're as you've been raising the fund?
So for us, we don't go anywhere into as much depth as others do in regards to trying to predetermine what the actual carbon impact is. We do that sort of a bit gut-feely at the early stages. Obviously, as companies get further down the track, you can actually have got a final product and whatnot, because we just see so much uncertainty in coming up with a number. Because the technology in the early stages, you think you're going to get to X, but reality is you're never going to beat X. You might beat X, but you might be less than X. So put shit in, get shit out. So we don't bother. We do talk about times, and I just go, well, why spend the time on something which we know is going to be vastly inaccurate? So we don't do that. So we gut feel, okay, pick it air conditioning because that's our subject matter. If you can get 50% saving on power consumption on an air conditioner, clearly it's going to have a huge impact. Air conditioning, like in India, if on the projections, is going to be like the biggest growth of energy consumption in the world over the next decade. It's astronomical quantity of power needed to power that, which will happen as they're getting wealthier, etc. So that's sort of how we broad brush that. Other investments and technologies are more difficult or not as obvious, and then we sort of debate where we see it and do we think that's great. But at the end of the day, to get investors in, you need to have the economic return. So we are very convinced that we can compete with other standard venture capital funds. Like if you look at our pre-existing portfolio of investments in the mandate of our current fund, we're sort of sitting around that 25% IRR, which is competitive with anyone else.
And so we talked about this yesterday. What's it been like kind of shifting from being investing off the balance sheet and taking pitches to going out and having to pitch for funding?
Well, we still take the pitches, thank God, because if it was us doing the pitches, we wouldn't be there. It's been interesting. It's really interesting hearing different people's philosophies on the whole decarbonisation and VC space. So you get the obvious ones who just don't believe in climate change. That's fine. You get those that believe in climate change but not really sure what to do about it. You get those who believe in climate change but don't want to invest in it. And you go, well, why not? They go, just not sure. Then some will say, you're too early stage, or they'll say, I'm not sure of the returns. Then you'll get those saying, this fund's you're too early stage, the fund's too small, etc. So there are a whole range of people out there, and you just, it's their money, they make the decisions on what they want to do. Our role there, obviously you get those who are very enthusiastic, etc. But those that aren't ready, or maybe they got money, they really love you, but it doesn't suit them in their investment cycle to invest. And on that area, like the private credit funds have been sort of really hard to beat, because people think that the private credit fund sort of offering 15% is a much better risk reward opportunity than.
They're yet to see the failures which will happen.
Well, that's right. Like, people think private credit is risk free, but time will see where that ends up as an analysis. So just plugging away and just saying, okay, we'll just keep you in the picture and update people, get in touch with them every few months, etc. And hopefully when we do next fund, or we need to do something else, with people going, oh yeah, actually I've been following you for however long, I like what you're doing, I'll come on board next time around. So yeah, we're very much on the slow burn on that.
Product thinking in a early stage business context, you're constantly taking feedback from customers and iterating on the product. Like, through that cycle, through that feedback, through that pitching process, are you iterating on the offer, or are you staying really firm on what you're going to market with and just bringing the people in that
you say
in terms of the fund
portfolio?
So like you're saying, like you early stage, these are the sectors that you're focused on. This is the way that you manage the portfolio. Is there? Do you ever tweak that pitch? No, you're clear on what you're doing.
Once you make your pitch up front, we don't change it, and we're 100% straight down the line during that fund's life. Like, we don't.
What you see is what you get.
Yeah, and that's sort of always been one of the family's mottos. You do what you say, and your words you bond, etc. So yeah, we don't move, and they're like, we've got a team, and sometimes people in the team say, oh, we should do this, or should do that, and go, no, we said we're going to do this, and that doesn't really fit. So yeah, I guess that's one aspect, as sort of the family and the individual who sort of set up the fund and has capacity to sort of manage the fund according to our principles. We're not chasing asset under management, and sure, we are chasing returns, but we're not going to deviate from what we say we're going to do, or from our moral standards, etc., to chase a higher return.
Got it. Makes absolute sense. I guess that the core of the pitch that you go out to, that you go out with. So yes, here are the characteristics. Here's the stage. Here's how we're going to manage it. Why you?
Not many people made their first investment 25 years ago. Not many people went to COP4 in 1998.
Still haven't been.
That's the only one I've been to, I admit, though. So I don't think there are many people who have been interested in the space for as long as I have. As an individual investor in the space, we've put a lot of money to work. We've taken a company from idea to listing on NASDAQ.
Wow.
So we have that life experience. We've had a number of failures. We've some successes, individually passionate. So I think a lot of funds are set up by a group of people who are sort of, I guess, relatively new to the space, might have great track record doing funds in other areas, etc. But actually in this quite defined area of investments, there aren't many who sort of really do the same as what we do. And there aren't many funds where the actual GP has as much money on the table with them as in this case either.
Just get in the game.
Yep.
Got it. Makes a ton of sense. And so let's pivot now to the Australian landscape in particular. So when we spoke yesterday, we talked about China and the the state capitalism, and the US with the Inflation Reduction Act and the incentives kind of pushing those markets, really accelerating them away from where Australia can keep up. Is there anything we can do to keep up? Is there anything we can do here locally to accelerate growth within the Australian ecosystem?
Look, I don't think Australia is lagging as much as everyone says. The issue we have is changing, I guess, legislation, the will around it. But we've still got very high solar growth. The EV vehicle you'd like to see growing more strongly, but I think part of that is just actually still having the right product for the market. So I bought one of the first Tesla X's, which obviously was an expensive car, luxury car. Time had it.
The green premium.
Yeah. Well, but any, like a BMW costs like,
course, absolutely.
If you consider that a brand new car company can be at the same level as a BMW, look, it had a few issues with, and I think selling it after 5 years was the right time to sell it. Just started showing wear and tear in a few places where sort of a BMW may not, but that's neither here nor there. But for the average consumer, you need products which satisfy their day-to-day needs. So one of them is range, and that's one where I think the anti-EV lobby has really done well by bringing in this range anxiety. Reality is the majority of Australians don't need more than bloody 100 k's range. So that's disappointing. But cost of vehicles up until 6 months ago, 9 months ago, has been a real issue. Like, they've been more expensive. Clearly, we've had this cost of, well, we still do have this cost of living issue that a lot of people are facing. So I don't think it's really surprising, but I think you'll see that change. I think the new models coming through, the price points, etc., are dramatic. Like, I have a hybrid today. For people in my family, everyone's got a car. That's the only EV type. Why? Well, there's just nothing really compelling out there which goes, yes, that's the vehicle I want. But I certainly see in another 18 months, when you see the cars coming, like being released and being talked about, where that sort of can happen. And then when you look in the commercial side of it, the same thing. Like, you look at agriculture and like the Hiluxes or whatever, like, there is no battery option at the moment. Or they're coming in really expensive. I think the car manufacturers are misreading that market. Everything's fancy, bigger, etc. When actually, as a farmer, I'd rather have something which is basic, and price point's much more important than having a fancy vehicle. So, yeah, well, I think that'll evolve itself. The electricity grid, the reality is a lot of it's that approval process. So that's the issue of state government versus federal governments and whatnot. I think the putting in the power lines, it should have just been compulsory acquisition and just deal with the political flack, because the current process is bullshit. It's just way too slow and costly. So that's my view on that. I know people who will shoot me for saying that if they hear me, because they're potentially being impacted by some of the proposals which they hate. But yeah, it is what it is. We had plenty of farms with big power lines run through them, and it's just life.
Something you deal with. The role for universities and banks. So we're talking about the government sector. Any thoughts on the role of universities and banks?
Well, universities are clearly where majority of the scientific tech comes from. The issue for the unis is actually how to educate their academics, their scientists, etc., how to prepare themselves and their ideas for commercial outcome. So I was in China last week and met a guy who's actually working on creating a course for those people to train them on how to actually take something from their scientific lab into a market and create a business, etc.
Commercialization process.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Smart. And then you've got, on the bank side, well, banks will just wait until they think the risk reward's there, and it's a hard one. It's a real hard one. Look, it just is what it is. We all think banks do it. Everyone complains about banks. Oh, didn't do this, didn't do that, and
they've also got all our money, right? So we want them to be thinking that way.
Well, yeah, but people forget that. But also, a lot of their restrictions are based on things that have happened in the past and new regulations which are put on them, etc. So, and I think, like, you talk about house lending, etc. So some of the criteria which have been put on banks are actually why first home buyers can't get borrowings, because trying to protect people from being lent money which they can't afford, and then the criteria which the banks have to assess them under, they don't pass. So we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot.
And then there's a Royal Commission about it. Everyone gets in trouble. It's a funny move around.
That's what happened. That's where the banks are now. So you speak to, like, ANZ CEO will tell you we can't, like, the system's broken now because we can't lend to the people. So then the first home buyers are pushed to alternative lenders who are more expensive. So the people who can least afford paying higher interest rates are paying the highest interest rates.
So let's talk about other investors. You mentioned, as you were going around, some people didn't believe in climate change. Those are a lost cause, probably, at least for us. For the people that are hesitant about investing in the climate space, what would you say to them?
Well, we say we have a track record which is positive to date, and for those people, you just need to keep putting data in front of them which supports that that climate investing, or decarbonisation investing particularly, is a competitive product for them to consider for their portfolio.
It's pretty interesting, I guess, like thinking about your point on you've been investing for, since 1999. That's a pretty powerful message, because a large amount of the objection that I hear from VCs that are trying to raise right now, or trying to raise a second fund, or trying to raise from, say, institutional investors like superannuation, they can't raise because they're a first-time manager and they don't have that track record. So you are in a unique position where you actually have a track record and a predictable return rate.
Well, we have a track record, but it's not in that format of the fund. So we've done 25 investments but it's not just in decarb. So then they say, are you cherry picking? You go, well, no, they're the ones which fit the mandate. And then they say, are there any you're not including? Go, no, they're not. But, like, without having that formality around it, they're all questions and concerns going by people saying, well, they could just be bullshitting.
Got it.
etc. So whilst we have been around for a long time, until you have that formal fund performance, it's difficult. It certainly helps, though. Like, there are people who we've been able to talk to and get interested because of what we've done in the past. But yeah, it still has its issues.
I guess you could afford to be selected, right? So that's
yeah. Look, we're not particularly selective like most people. Like, we have a pretty low investment minimum for our LPs in this fund, and part of that was so people could sort of dip their toe in the water and come along for a ride, and hopefully do future funds they're comfortable and continue, and hopefully write bigger checks.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So thinking about Australia again, so globally the climate sector has some challenges. So there's competition for funding, regulatory hurdles. Australian companies in particular have challenges scaling internationally. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for Australia to stand out? Australian startups?
Look, I don't think a particular sector or segment stands out. Look, it's a matter of, if you have a brilliant idea and you're a great founder who's smart enough and you can pull the right team together, whatever it is can work. I guess the one thing where you'd say probably really difficult would be batteries. Batteries, I think, are really tough. That China ecosystem is going to be hard to break. Like we saw Northvolt, they've raised $15 billion and they've gone bust, with all the Europeans supporting them. So, I think batteries is a real tough one to break into in Australia. Our costs of just even like you hear, like take 4 years, say, to plan, like from idea to maybe get a factory even sort of approved. In China, you can go from idea to actually have factory set up in 18 months. So,
12 or 18 months. That was Tesla's timeline, right?
So just that, and let alone what. So that's just a timeline, let alone the actual cost, and obviously cost has interest implications and technology implications of how, like you've got a 4-year, like when your build window is and all that. So I really see it difficult, even if you go full robotics, whilst the planning process is so long and the construction cost is so long. Like in Australia, you go build a factory, you got 8 hours a day to be on site if you're lucky. China, they work 20 hours. Like it's just, and the US isn't much better than Australia. It is a bit cheaper, but it has some similar problems. So, and the rest of the West is the same. So, yeah, when everyone talks about onshoring jobs, we need to remember that for the last 20 years, the developed world has been importing deflation from China. Like everything we buy, which has made in China in it, including your iPhone, is cheaper than it would have been if China didn't exist.
That's a great catchphrase, importing deflation. That's magic.
So when you hear Trump say he's going to put tariffs on everything out of China, that's going to, I think, cause inflation. So it'll be really interesting to see to what extent that actually happens, and if it does happen, for how long it stays around. There are plenty of reasonable arguments as to why the US thinks that they're being screwed by China on a trade situation. But at some point, it's a matter of how they work that through into a position where they think they're being more fairly dealt with.
It's the first time someone's articulated that problem in such a simple way. Thank you. That's very insightful. So for climate tech founders that are listening that might want to work with Twynam, what stage do you target? What's the check size that you write? And then what's one thing they need to understand about working with you to secure funding?
So we go from sort of we'll invest from pretty much past an idea through to sort of, we say Series B, but it's really Series A. It's just depending on the terminology. So some people call like a seed round, what's how the people call a Series B, and vice versa, etc. So there's a whole plethora of ideas there. Would generally write up to 1.5 US. So from quite small, but ideally sort of from 500 to 1.5. Working with us, we try to really help people, but every fund says the same, so take that with a pinch of salt. We obviously have particular sectors where we are really strong in understanding. So obviously the ag sector is a classic example, but there are certain other industrial sectors where we've had a lot of experience in.
What are those sectors?
All insect farming, so in that. That whole HVAC sector we've been following for a long time and understand. So there are a couple of there in particular. What you really need, like in every fund says the same, but to come up with an investment proposal, obviously you need a viable tech process and proof of how you're going to get there, how quickly you're going to iterate, how you're going to get to what you think your CapEx cost is going to be, and how you're going to prove what your OpEx is. Who's your team going to be? How are you going to modify your team as your business evolves? Are you thinking you're going to be the CEO, or in 2 years' time you get to a point you're going to step aside, someone else going to step in, that sort of thing. And then the governance issues, like how's the business going to be governed? Who's going to control what? Some founders want to control everything, but not, like the money's coming from somewhere else, and that just isn't viable, because if you're a first-time founder, you've probably never been a director of a business, and etc. So there are all those aspects which you need to be pretty clear on and understand, and also realise you can have the best idea and it may not take market share. Go back to the videotape, VHS versus Beta. The worst tech actually won the battle because Beta was a much better video cartridge than VHS, but it got the market share. It made the agreements with particular users, manufacturers of the film industry, etc., and that's who dominated. And the world is littered of great tech which hasn't made it for whatever reason. So that how you commercialise it is important, and understanding who your potential future investors are.
Are you guys patient?
Yeah, we're a 10-year fund. In this space, you have to be patient. You're not. If you think you're going to get out of here in 3 years, you're done and dusted. We're not very patient on, though, when the iteration cycle falls down or when people clearly aren't, what they're trying to do doesn't work and you don't pivot. Like that gets very frustrating. Yeah.
Interesting. Is there anything specific you look for, any characteristics in a founder that you look for, or founding teams?
Look, that really varies depending on where they're up to in the stage. So, yeah, there are lots of things you look at. Competence and belief that they're capable of taking a business from wherever they are into the future is the biggest one. But like everybody's different, so you can have great tech skills and someone else complements you with the rest of the business management and with the commercial growth. I guess one area which really look at also, though, is that commercial route to market, that it doesn't get left behind the technical development. And generally, there are some products where there's no point making commercial routes unless you know you've got a product. But generally, people only concentrate on the tech and totally forget that commercial route.
It's got to, the money's got to make sense.
Well, you've got to be out. There's no point producing the world's best widget if you haven't spoken to anyone who's actually going to buy it. At some point in there, you need to start having some conversations with somebody to see how this world's best widget's going to actually make it.
How it fits together. So let's suspend disbelief for a second. Cast our minds forward to 2050. We've won. What does it look like?
We've won. What's the definition of won?
We've hit the target. We've hit the net zero
target.
What does the world look like?
What's the world look like? Well, most things are electrified, and electric power is coming from solar, wind, nuclear. So I don't quite know how that last one fits in a 25-year window, but let's say it's happened. I think we'll have autonomous vehicles. Most people won't own a car. We'll end up with sort of autonomous buses like an Uber or whatever, just driving around, and you'll say where you want to go, and you'll end up with a small community, like bus of 10 people, whatever, and it'll work out a route to get you there. There'll be more circularity in what we consume and the recycling. Clothing, I'm not quite sure how clothing is going to work at this point, but we've invested in a couple of businesses in that space, and they struggle, is reality. The food industry will have much lower, or we would have found a solution for enteric methane.
Yeah.
Nitrogenous fertiliser will be decarbonised. Steel will be in a very different methodology of production. We will have found an alternative to cement or part. I don't know. We come up with a full solution for cement. It's probably one of those difficult. I'm not sure that we have a solution for SaaS. I'm not sure electric aeroplanes work in the manner that aircraft work today, but we'll see. If we've hit the targets, we've got to come up with some solutions to all of these. Alternatively, like you still have aircraft burning Jet A1 kerosene today, and we have some great methodologies of carbon storage. So there are some possible solutions for that, which we're aware of and have invested in, those really hard to abate industries I just don't think are worth worrying about. I think the much cheaper and logical option is just to offset. But you were going to talk about offsets earlier.
We missed the vote. We missed the vote. We missed the vote on offsets. We could save it for a follow up. The next question is the question that I ask everyone on the podcast. I'm not sure if it's relevant because you've given us so many. One big climate opportunity you think we're all missing?
That we're missing? I don't think we're missing any. Like someone's working on everything. The question is, there will be a better way of doing it. Where society's missing is we're not putting enough money into the early stage techs.
Or supporting the early stage tech and scaling.
That's actually probably the worst area, like that first of a kind, which is really, it is high risk. So I get why there's a problem with it. But that's the area where as a world society, we could really work on coming up with the solutions, but there'll be a lot of failures in there. Like, there's no question. Like, we're sort of looking in that space. How do we do it? But you need to find some funders in there, some investors who understand it, and then the VC funds need to be good enough at selecting which ones to actually take forward.
Always be closing. That's where our climate bank is hoping to pitch into the picture. So good to get validation on the concept early. Johnny, thank you. That was brilliant.
Thank you, Anton. It's been fun.
And that was the last Climatalist episode of the season. Thanks so much for following our journey, and a giant thank you to our guests who have taught us an incredible amount about the profitability and innovation that sits within the climate space. 2025 is shaping up to be an even bigger year for the Climatalist team, and we can't wait to show you what we've got lined up. So make sure to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next year for season 2.